Okay, hello everyone. This is our continuation of Unit 2, Biology Basics, where we're covering a little bit of the basics of biochemistry and a little bit of cells, although we're not quite to cells yet. So we covered water. We did our properties of water lab. Some things went well, some things I think we need to work on more logistically and procedurally with labs and stuff like that. But hopefully we've got a good understanding of water and what water is and why it's kind of a special molecule and why we're so interested in finding it in like other places. But we're going to move on today to carbon and biomolecules. So that is our goal for the day, and we'll be covering this here in class in a day or two. So hopefully this is helpful for those of you all that would like to have this in a video. So to start off talking about carbon and biomolecules, we need to talk about common elements in biology, like why carbon. And so there's a phrase that you'll see certain times, biology teachers will use this phrase, chomps. All it is one of those kind of anagram things where you say the first letter of each word, C, H, O, N, P, and S. And so those are the most common elements in living systems and in molecules that are parts of living systems, whether we're talking about an organism or an entire kind of like ecosystem. This is what makes up most of everything. And so what that means is you are made up of almost entirely carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And so all of those important molecules that you're made of are made up almost entirely of those. So let's come back to these and just say quickly that there are actually a couple of other things in you, like a significant portion of the U is iron. Not as much as these up at the top, but I did want to mention these, especially because we'll come back to each of these when we get to body systems later on in the year. Iron is in a molecule called hemoglobin, which is really important in red blood cells where it carries oxygen through your body. So this protein called hemoglobin in red blood cells has to have iron in order to carry that oxygen. If it doesn't have enough iron, then it can't make hemoglobin properly, and then it can't carry oxygen. We have a name for that, and that would be anemia. Not having enough correctly functioning red blood cells are not able to carry enough oxygen around the body. So calcium, also important. You get it from green leafy vegetables. And oh, by the way, iron. That's why blood is red, because iron and oxygen combine to make a bright red color. So calcium is also really important in, of course, your bones. And it is also really important in your muscle contraction. And so calcium deficiencies can definitely lead to kind of like muscle issues and things like that. But it makes up your bones, and we all know that. That's why like what makes up what we're going to call compact bone later on in the year, the hard part of bone. So sodium and potassium, lots of really important functions. The most important one, we kind of combine them together, and this is going to be nerve function. In order for nerves to send messages to the brain, from the brain, and within the brain, you need a significant amount of sodium and potassium in those cells and around those cells. And so these right here are molecules that we have to have, but most of you is actually made up of these right here. And you can probably see why, right? We can combine these two and say, oh, that is water, right? And so a lot of us is water. We've also already talked about nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle and how we need nitrogen for things like DNA and protein. Well, we need phosphorus for similar reasons. It is also an important component of DNA. And another molecule that you will hear from me plenty, and that is going to be ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which has a significant amount of phosphorus in it. This is the energy molecule that cells use. We call it the energy currency. It's basically the molecule that cells use when they want to do energy-intensive processes like move and contract for muscles or build complex molecules, things like that. So sulfur, we're not going to talk about quite as much, but it is important in protein. And what it does is it helps proteins take certain specific shapes that cannot actually be changed. And so that's really kind of important. If we want to go back to carbon here, and that's kind of what our focus is today, carbon, well, we can just, as an example, if we combine all three of these, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, we're going to get things like carbohydrate carbohydrates, just as a name, right? It's got carbon in it, and then hydrate meaning water. So those have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in them. The question we want to focus on, though, is why carbon in the first place? Like, why is carbon so important? It's so important we have a name for molecules that are made up or primarily of what we're going to call a carbon backbone, and that would be organic. This is not the organic where you talk about like food that hasn't had pesticides and chemical fertilizers on it. This is organic in the sense of being made up primarily of a carbon backbone. So made of a carbon backbone. And so we use that term to describe molecules. You will say an organic molecule of glucose, which is made up of like a carbon skeleton, sometimes is what you say. Not all carbon-containing molecules are organic. In fact, like carbon dioxide is non-organic, and we can kind of see why once we get a few examples here. So, but the question is like, why is carbon so important? Well, if I did one of those Lewis dot structures of carbon, we can just put a C in the middle and start putting electrons on the outside. So we have our first pair of electrons right there. Carbon has an atomic number of 6, and so we've got 4 more. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that is 4 unpaired electrons right there. And hopefully you remember from last week and talking about atoms and molecules that atoms with unpaired electrons, that's one of the things that can lead to chemical reactions taking place, right? To fill up or get rid of unpaired electrons. And so we can fill those up with 1 from hydrogen, 1 from hydrogen, 1 from hydrogen, and 1 from hydrogen. And we can get CH4 or methane gas, right? And so if we wanted to, we could draw that as CH, H, H, and H, CH4 methane gas. So the reason carbon is important is because it can make 4 bonds, right? But the whole act of making 4 bonds seems like it's not important, but it really is, because you can take this methane and we can actually change something about it. This does not have to be a hydrogen. It can be another carbon. So we can do that. And we can do a hydrogen right here and here and here and here and here and here. And we can get C2H6 or ethane gas. And so all of a sudden you can start building long molecules, because then you could get rid of this one right here, and you could get, all of a sudden everything is going to be, you make a third one, C3H, what is that one? 8, C3H8 is propane. And so you can keep growing longer and longer to the point where if you keep going, you can get something like this. Carbon, carbon, carbon. I'm doing this from memory, so I hope I get it right. Carbon, carbon. And we'll do one more up here, carbon, and we go double bond oxygen, OH. I'm not sure about the directions here, but OH, OH. No. Let's go back. H, OH, H, OH, H, OH. We'll talk about this molecule much later on. OH, H, and H. So if I did this right, and it could be some little technical differences here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I need to get rid of one of those, and I'm not sure which one it is. So we get 6 oxygens, we get 12 hydrogens. So you get C6H12O6 or glucose. So to go back to why carbon is important, it can make things like a carbon backbone, long chains of carbons that you can then add other atoms to that allow those molecules to have different properties. And so that 4 bonding thing right there is really important when it comes to carbon. And we'll come back to glucose and make sure we get the correct drawing when we cover carbohydrates specifically in more detail in another unit. So, okay, so next up, if we've got this understanding of common elements in biology, is probably going to be, well, what are the common biomolecules in biology? Like if elements include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, what are the molecules that contain those? And we call those biomolecules or macromolecules involved in living processes, right? And so macro meaning big right there. So these tend to be really, really big, right? And so the 4 categories are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. This page right here is an introduction to all this kind of stuff. It is not the big detailed stuff. All the details are going to come later on as we cover like specific units about this. Like when we cover photosynthesis and cell respiration, let's go into more detail on carbohydrates. In fact, unit 3 is more about lipids and before we get to carbohydrates. So we will cover these in great detail, but this is just kind of introducing you so you're used to some of these terms. So if we wanted to have like other things that they might be known as, we could call carbohydrates sugars. That doesn't mean that they're sweet because the bark of a tree is made of carbohydrates and it's not sweet at all. But a lot of times you will see those two terms used. So carbohydrates can sometimes be called sugars, and you might even see things like simple sugars versus complex sugars. Lipids, although this is more of an example, will sometimes be called fats, and so that is kind of another name that you might use. Proteins, you'll see the word polypeptide, and nucleic acids don't really have one. So if we wanted to think about like, okay, let's get something really specific about each one, right? And so carbohydrates, they end in OSE, and so that's going to help us get some examples. Lipids, hopefully you realize from our talk on water, they're hydrophobic, and they do not mix with water because they're, for the most part, nonpolar symmetrical molecules that are hydrophobic and don't like water. And polypeptides, they have a complex 3D shape. And nucleic acids, there's so much to know about this. Let's cover that over like several different units. And so that's going to be a whole lot later on. So, all right, let's go all the way across carbohydrates. So we know they end in OSE. We know they are sugars. So if we want some examples, I bet you guys realize that we were talking about glucose. So glucose is that C6H12O6 molecule that we were talking about, but not all carbohydrates are glucose. You can also have sucrose or table sugar. You can have lactose or milk sugar. You can have cellulose or plant fiber. You can have amylose or plant starch, and they end in OSE. So if you see that, you got to think that's a name for a carbohydrate or a sugar. They have lots of functions, but if we wanted to give it one function, they provide energy for a living organism or a cell to do and perform life's processes, right? They're the direct source of energy that allows that cell to make ATP and do things. So their energy density, because energy density is really important for them, is 4 kilocalories per gram. What that means is if you have 1 gram of carbohydrates, this is an average, by the way, but in general, if you have 1 gram of carbohydrates, it is worth 4 kilocalories. And that means like the calories that we're dealing with when you talk about food. If you have 2 grams, then you have 8 calories. If you have 3 grams of carbohydrates, then you have 12 kilocalories. So, and so that just tells us how much energy is present in them. And the monomer name is the individual unit. As we talk about these, we need to think about how big molecules are made up like chains, right? So when we talk about like starch and fiber and cellulose and stuff like that, they're long chains of molecules, but the monomer is the single individual part or unit that makes up the bigger part, right? And that each one of these has a different monomer name. And for carbohydrates, it is going to be a monosaccharide. Okay, so a single sugar, saccharide also means sugar. We're going to get a lot of these terms in our vocab list. So we got monosaccharides. All right, lipids or fats. Well, we can talk about things like wax, because you guys should know that one from the properties of water lab. We also have things like oil, right? So like vegetable oil, olive oil, stuff like that. And of course, we do have animal fat right there, which is why fat is not really another name for lipids, but a lot of times it gets used interchangeably. It's more of an example of a lipid. So oils, fats, and waxes are going to be are examples. There's some very specific ones, things like phospholipid that we're going to be talking about in our notes a lot. But for now, just think oils, fats, and waxes. So their primary cellular function, they have lots also. I want to break this into 2. One is that they are really good at storing energy. The second one has specifically to do with this phospholipid. It makes up the cell membrane. And that's going to become really important when we talk about separating inside from outside and cell transport. That's the next unit. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on that. So it turns out because they're good at storing energy, they need to have a higher energy density or kilocalories per gram, and they are around 9 kilocalories per gram. So they're more than double the energy in the same amount of space. And the monomer name is known as a fatty acid right there. So, all right, proteins, which take complex three-dimensional shapes, and they give lots of shapes, means lots of structures. Some examples would be things like keratin, right? Keratin is the protein that makes up our hair and also our skin and our fingernails. And so it can be tough and flexible and hard, but that's what makes up hair, skin, and fingernails. We also have things like collagen, or the protein that is space filling in the human body and in animals, and kind of fills up our space, makes animals pretty squishy in general when you're not dealing with bones, and that would be collagen. There's a whole bunch of, we've already talked about hemoglobin, right? As a protein that carries oxygen. So all of these are structures, right? And so they're structures that have complex functions, whether it's protecting your body or filling your space or carrying oxygen. So their primary cellular function is making up structures. But what I want you to think about is how different structures will give us different functions, because they have this thing where the structure function relationship, where if you change the structure, you change the function. And that means keratin has a different structure than collagen, so it has a different function than collagen. So we can also use them for energy, and that would be 4 kilocalories per gram. And our monomer name is the amino acid. Again, we'll look at all of these more structurally in detail as we get into these later on in the year. So nucleic acids, they don't really have, like I said, another name. Examples would include DNA. Hopefully you all know DNA. That Na stands for nucleic acid, so deoxyribonucleic acid. But we also have this thing called RNA, or ribonucleic acid. We also have ATP. There's also other ones like GTP and TTP and CTP and UTP. So there's a whole bunch of them. The most important ones are these right here. Their primary cellular function, if we were to use DNA as our example, is storing and transmitting genetic information. That is not ATP, that's about energy. But DNA and RNA store, transmit, and process cellular or genetic information. The monomer name is going to be the nucleotide. And you better believe we spend a lot of time in the year, especially later on, closer to the holiday season, talking about nucleic acids. So we will focus on that later on in the year. And to finish this up, because we talked about monomers, it's probably a good idea to introduce a few things about monomers versus polymers. So I do want to kind of do that and mention how this works. So I call this polymer principles. So we're not going to do any specific molecule. We're just going to use some general kind of shapes and terms. But basically, because these molecules are big, think of like chains, right? They're large molecules made up of smaller pieces. So on the left-hand side, I'm going to have one molecule called A, B, C, D, and E. Okay. And on the right-hand side, I'm going to have A, B, C, D, and E. And so all of these include the same things, but in this one, they're individual units, or what we're going to call monomers. And over here, they're polymers. Okay, so monomers are individual pieces, the links in the chain, but not put together, and the polymer is the long chain. And the reactions that can go in one direction or the other are going to be known as dehydration, synthesis. Okay, to make a big molecule, it is called dehydration synthesis, and to break that molecule up, that is called hydrolysis. And we're going to get a ton of these terms in our vocab again as we do this. So if you think about what's going on here, this is a complex molecule and these are small, simple ones. Well, if you want to make something complex, think about putting together a big like Lego set from the individual Legos. That takes energy. You got to put energy into it. And then if you take this complex thing and you break it up into its pieces, that can release things like energy, right? And so that's the general idea here, right? So when plants are growing and making, doing photosynthesis, they are making big complex polymers. And then if we eat them and if we digest them, then they can be broken back down into the monomers. And it's just this long cycle of making and breaking monomers and polymers. And it gets into metabolism and catabolic and anabolic processes, a bunch of stuff that we're going to talk about all year long. But I do want to explain why they're called this. And so I need to switch over from this to a specific example. And my specific example is going to be involving glucose. So I'm going to delete this and go over here and I'm going to put your first molecule of glucose. There's one. And there's one. So we use hexagons to represent glucose because of one of the shapes that they take, and it's just kind of easy to do that. And we don't put all the carbons and hydrogens on there because if we draw a hexagon in a biology class, we're talking about glucose. What we can do is put the little oxygen and hydrogen right there, and then right there. We don't put all the rest of them. So this is C6H12O6, and so this is 2 glucose monomers, right? But then over here, if we draw what's going to be 1 maltose polymer, you sometimes would see it called dimer, but it's a polymer as well. You would have an oxygen holding them together, okay? So remember, we called this dehydration synthesis, right? So what happens, and the reason it's called that, is when you link these two together, 2 hydrogens and an oxygen are removed. H2O. You pull the water molecule out. You've dehydrated the water molecule, or you've dehydrated the glucose molecules to synthesize something and put something together, right? And that's where that last oxygen is, that one right there. And you've made this larger molecule right here. So this is what plants do with a lot of their glucose. And then they keep going, right? Because you can keep adding on another one right here, OH, if you wanted to do it again. But if you wanted to then break that down, well, you would have to add water in order to get back to where you started, because it's missing 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. So you got to add those 2 hydrogens and oxygen to get back here. And we call that hydrolysis, or in your vocab, breaking things down with the energy and power of water right there. And so we're going to get hydro and lyse and syn right there. And so that is a real life example. We will see this one again when we cover photosynthesis and sugars and that kind of stuff in greater detail. So that is my little introduction to carbon and biomolecules and polymers and big molecules and small molecules. And we'll cover this in the sense of like nutrients with nutrient labels. We will cover this in the sense of like identifying biomolecules, testing for biomolecules, and those are some of the labs that we're going to be doing as we get into this, and then move on to cells, because cells are next. So hopefully this was helpful to you guys. I'm going to, let's see, stop presenting, and I will see you guys in class when we cover this material.